Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Institute of Public Policy, Atma Jaya University. My name is Yos Kenawas, and I will be the moderator for today's event. So this afternoon we will review a book by Dr. Romel Kuraming titled Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia, State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. Dr. Kuraming is a senior assistant professor at the History and International Studies program of University of Brunei Darussalam. He received his PhD in Southeast Asian Studies at Australian National University, and prior to his appointment at UBD, Dr. Kuraming was a postdoctoral fellow at La Trobe University and National University of Singapore. Dr. Kuraming's research interests, among others, revolve around the issue of comparative history and historiography, politics of knowledge production, memory of violence, and this is very interesting, fast food and transnational identity in Southeast Asia. I think it's related to Jollibee, is it? Oh, okay. He published many articles in prestigious academic journal, and today he is going to present his book that compares the state-scholar relations during Marcos and Suharto's era, and I think it is important topic, particularly because the two autocrats seem heavily invested to rewrite the national history according to their political interest. I would also like to welcome Dr. Yosef Jakababa, who will be our discussant for today's event. Dr. Jakababa is a senior lecturer at the School of Government and Global Affairs of Universitas Pelita Harapan. He is also a co-founder of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies Indonesia, a research center that focuses on Southeast Asian studies. Dr. Jakababa received his MA in Southeast Asian Studies and another MA and PhD in History from University of Wisconsin-Madison under the supervision of the legendary Alfred McCoy. Is it correct? Yes. And Dr. Jakababa is interested in modern Indonesia and Southeast Asia history, international affairs, Cold War, identity and nationalism. He publishes articles in a number of prestigious journals and newspapers. If you happen to come to Association for Asian Studies conference in the States, you will likely to meet Dr. Jakababa because he is one of the key members of the American Institute for Asian Studies, or AIFIS. And without further ado, Dr. Kuraming, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yos. I'd like to thank first the Institute of Public Policy of Atma Jaya University, the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, and Center for Southeast Asian Studies Indonesia for organizing this talk. Also, I'd like to thank Joseph for kind help in organizing this. Also, thank you everyone for taking your time to be with us this afternoon. I know you're rushing, you wish to rush to go home because it's a long day, and I really appreciate your taking time to be with us today. The book that I will discuss with you today is a product of my PhD thesis. It took a long while for this book to be published. And I'm just feel relieved and happy that finally it has. This book is it's a comparison of two history writing projects, and I use these two history writing projects, one in the Philippines and one in Indonesia, in order to highlight a number of important questions, to raise a number of important questions that have implications on how we do scholarship, how we know. So all those kind of fundamental questions that were raised in the book. So the first book is Tadhana project, which was this project was sponsored by Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos was a former president of the Philippines. He was a well-known dictator. And he really did a lot of effort in order to have this kind of project. It was under his name, but it was written for him by a group of very well-known or respected, highly respected scholars in the Philippines, particularly from the University of the Philippines. And this project is very controversial, and one reason for that is precisely because of the participation of these scholars. University of the Philippines is well known to be the hotbed of progressive politics in the Philippines. So it's a very people who are anti-state, anti-Marcos, you can find in the University of the Philippines. And the mere fact that these scholars joined in this project was some kind of a scandal for many of these intellectuals in the country. So this is a very ambitious project. The idea is to produce 21 volumes of very comprehensive Philippine history, starting from Big Bang all the way to the 1970s, the time when Marcos time. Okay, so next please. The other is, as you are all familiar, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia under Suharto. So there are 6 volumes in this project, also ambitious, but not as ambitious as the Tadhana. And this, unlike Tadhana, that was some kind of a secret project, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia was undertaken under the watchful eyes of the media, so there's nothing secret about it. And this was also participated by some of the most important, brilliant scholars in Indonesia during the time. And it was also become controversial, but unlike the case of Tadhana, this project was welcomed in the beginning only when it was published that controversies were raised. Next, please. Okay. In instances like this, probably it would be better for me to stand up. Okay, in instances like this, when we have official history, the usual tendency is scholars who take part in this kind of project, they are normally viewed as co-opted or manipulated. And the history they write is considered some kind of distorted, unofficial history, a propaganda. And it's not unusual for scholars to be given this kind of labels, such as intellectual prostitutes, academic mercenaries. In the case of the Philippines, Tadhana, tuta ni Makoy, which means Marcos lapdog. So, of course, this kind of ideas, there was this presumption of what is ideal. And the ideal situation was scholars are supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to be able to raise above politics. And scholars are supposed to be public intellectuals who speak truth to power. So in this instance, the idea is the scholarly stands in opposition to the political. And it's just a matter of, the idea is, if you really are a true scholar, then you will be rigorous in your practice, scholarship. You will get the empirical aspects right, methodologically correct. You have to come up with a theoretical formulation that is defensible. And it's just a matter of going all these kind of things, achieving all these kind of things, and you neutralize the political. So that's a basic idea. Next, please. Okay, let me discuss some of the key findings. The first one, has to do with, there are indeed in these two projects elements that confirm the conventional view. In Marcos, for example, while Marcos allowed maximum of freedom, they allowed freedom for scholars to exercise whatever they like to do. They write, they formulated the framework, they research. So despite those kind of maximum freedom enjoyed by scholars in Tadhana, when it comes to the time, 1966 onward, when Marcos was already there as the president, it is documented that Marcos really did things to manipulate the results. So I indicated there some kind of a story that showed how Marcos was unhappy with the draft of the chapters or that particular volume, and he had it redone or rewritten. Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, on the other hand, is also replete with all this kind of biases against Sukarno, the old order, and the Partai Komunis Indonesia. So there are also instances in SNI where the scholarly interest, the scholarly power was given, the scholarly interest prevailed over political interests. And I narrated in a chapter in the book, how did this happen? Rather unintentionally, even those people who are involved in the project, even the most important historians like Sartono Cardoderjo, when I interviewed him and he was still alive, he had no idea. As far as what he could remember about the project was very negative. So that idea that there were a lot of problems in the project, the multidimensional approach was not really carried properly. So that's what he remembered about the project. He didn't know, he had no idea that the implementation of the multidimensional approach to history managed to set a frame, that kind of limits by which Nugroho, Noto Santo, and his group pushed their agenda. So I also demonstrate that in the book. So in other words, this idea of scholarly and the political as contradictory, as oppositional elements in these projects. They are not called official histories for nothing. There are good reasons why they're called official histories. Now, the important point I'd like to highlight, however, is that this oppositional relationship between the scholarly and the political is just one of the possibilities. It's just one of the possibilities. There are instances when these two were complementary. There were instances when they ran parallel to one another or somehow unrelated. And there are instances, and it's the most difficult to demonstrate, of that kind of mutuality between the interests of the political and the scholarly. This kind of oppositional relationship is emphasized while the other possibilities are downplayed. And I argue in the book that this is the case because they undermine the interest of the scholarly class. So when you emphasize this kind of oppositional relationship, that's the source of the power of the scholarly class. By downplaying all those other possibilities, I demonstrate in the book that because the interest of the scholarly class is to be seen as disinterested, they're supposed to be above the fray, above politics, and that's the source of their power. So when they get to be seen as somebody who are supporting the political interest, then they demonstrate that kind of they demonstrate that that kind of inherently complementary relationship between the two, and that undermines the interest of the entire scholarly class. Next, please. Okay, so finding number 2. Still, as an offshoot of this tendency to regard scholarly in the political as oppositional, there was this common tendency to regard that so long as you are rigorous in your scholarship, then you will be able to neutralize the political. Those that were manipulated, they were manipulated because of the weakness in their scholarship. And in the post-Suharto years, when a lot of complaints were raised about the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, one of the common things that were discussed, mentioned during the time was SNI was manipulated, was some kind of propaganda, because the scholarship was not strong enough. So there were scholars who expressed that kind of view. And if only scholarly strength would be demonstrated, then they should be able to neutralize the political. But as I mentioned earlier, despite the weaknesses of the SNI as a project, in scholarly terms, it set the limits to the political interest of the regime. And when I say this, I'm referring to the original edition. Because one question that we have to highlight when we talk about Sejarah Nasional Indonesia is which one? Which one? The 1975 edition I'm referring to. Because other SNI untuk SMP and SMA, these are the textbooks. Supposedly, were just shortened version or simplified version of the real one. And two, particularly the textbook for SMP, it came soon after the original came out. So 1976, it already came out. And this, when you take a close look, when you compare these two, these are two very different projects. The approach was very different. The framework was very different. And the reason for this difference is precisely because, one, the original was carried out under the control, to a great extent, of Sartono Cardoderjo. The textbooks were written under the control, under the supervision of Nugroho Nito Susanto. So Nugroho was not a fan of multidimensional approach. He was the one who liked to do a narrative kind of history. Okay? And in this alone, you would see that kind of difference. So despite the weakness in scholarly terms, despite so many complaints about the SNI, the original one, it managed to restrict that kind of political interest. It was the textbooks that were truly virulent as propaganda. The original one, you'd be surprised that for as official history, the original one hardly mentioned about it ended a few days after October 1, 1965. You'd be surprised that it didn't even say good things about the new order. So if the idea of the SNI as an official history is to glorify, to justify the new order, you'd find it really very surprising that they didn't do that. I discuss in the book why was that the case. So there was the details of that kind of thing. So, in other words, even if SNI is scholarly weak, it managed to set that kind of frame. Now, in the case of Tadhana, is the reverse. The strength of scholarship It does not mean protection from the political manipulation. In 1970s, by 1970s, when you compare the development of historical profession in the Philippines and in Indonesia, the one in the Philippines is particularly much more developed. There were already so many PhDs in history among the Filipino scholars. By 1970s, they already had about 70 years of history of professionalization. In the case of Indonesia, during the time, profession was still very weak. There were only 2 PhDs in histories during the time. Taufik Abdullah and Sartono Cortaderjo. So you would see, in the case of Philippines, that kind of strength was there. And Marcos precisely wanted a very scholarly history. Marcos could have easily, because in the Philippines there were a stable of military historians, and he could have easily chosen to ask them to write history for me. But Marcos was not interested in that kind of historian. Marcos wanted the best historians, the best scholars, the best archaeologists, the best art historians that was available in the Philippines during that time. So it is precisely the strength of scholarship that Marcos needed for his political interest. Why was that the case? Next, please. Next, please. Thanks. Okay, Marcos wanted the most rigorous scholarship possible because he believed that a highly scholarly history can withstand the test of critical scrutiny, that can stand the test of time. Because he knew very well that considering how contentious, how divisive politics in the Philippines during the time, nobody will really take Tadhana seriously. So he wanted Tadhana not for the people during the time. He wanted Tadhana to be written for future generations, whom he believed will be more fair. They will be capable of judging him fairly. During the time, the 1970s, he knew that nobody would take Tadhana project seriously. So he was setting his eyes in the future generations, perhaps a century hence, when people will be more or less fair in judging his work. Next, please. Okay. So the third finding, third idea, main idea in the book, we have this idea that when we talk about politics, we focus on the content. We can find politics in the content, what is being said by history, what is being said by knowledge. And this idea is precisely the reason why scholars, for example, in Tadhana project, they would tell you that, well, I wrote the chapter or the book, the volume on rock formation, on geological process. So what politics can there be in rock formation? Another scholars would say that, well, I wrote about the pre-Hispanic period or the early Hispanic period. So these areas are too far removed from Marcos. So insofar as they're concerned, there was no politics there. But if you take a look at all of these kind of things, if you take a look at Marcos' interest, and Marcos' interest lies in indigenous history, the kind of history that will be able to be taken as an alternative to the liberal and the Marxist kind of historiography in the Philippines. And in his view, these were coming from the West. And what we needed are something truly indigenous. So this kind of indigenous history is supposed to be, it provide that kind of authentic history. And the farther you go back in time, then the more authentic it is. And how farther can you go but on the rock formation? So it is in the rock that the authenticity of Filipino identity you can trace. So even if these scholars had really no intention and they couldn't believe when they were told that, well, even the pre-Hispanic history, the early Hispanic history, all of these kind of things fit into his idea that the history of the Philippines is evolving to reach that kind of destiny that was the Marcos era. So the title of the book, Tadhana, it means destiny. Okay? So that is the idea. Tadhana, referring to destiny. It's a destiny, supposedly, waiting to happen that Marcos would declare martial law and establish this kind of new society. So, in other words, it is in the way how knowledge, it is in the way how this kind of knowledge is used, the context in which a particular knowledge is used that ultimately decides what is the political. Okay? It's not the intentions of the author. It is the context of actual knowledge used. And also, while the ideas were still, because you see, Tadhana was not taken really seriously in the Philippines. So nobody paid attention to Tadhana. Those kind of books, hardbound, you can find them in places like being sold for 20 pesos, 30 pesos in the 1980s when the Marcos were gone. So it was, in other words, trashed. Despite the high level of scholarship put into it. Now, once these ideas were taken outside of the Tadhana project, beyond the signature of Marcos, and that is what happened to these famous approaches, Pantayong Pananaw and Psikolohiyang Pilipino. Very also rooted in the efforts to indigenization. And these became very respectable and accepted kind of approaches. So they developed outside of Tadhana as a highly respected kind of approach. But so long as still within Tadhana, nobody paid attention to it. Next, please. So the fourth is, okay, normally we take knowledge as something that is easily manipulated, easily manipulable. We take knowledge as an inert. It's easily controlled. That's the common understanding we have of knowledge, of history. And the reason, for example, why there are a lot of history wars, that kind of manipulation of history, is precisely because the manipulability of history, of knowledge in general. But if we try to reverse the question and ask, for example, why is it that powerful leaders like Marcos and the Suharto regime, why they needed history to justify themselves? If they are truly powerful, then there should be no need for history. But why? And this is particularly very clear in the case of Marcos. If you have read Marcos' diaries, for example, there are pages, there are entries in that diary where you would see him thinking, musing. He said, he was asking himself, how would I be judged in history? So that kind of sense of unease, okay? Marcos had some kind of fear of historians and the judgment of history. And at some point, he wrote there that history is too important to be left to the historians. That's the idea. Okay, so in other words, history or knowledge has its own power. Okay? History has its power that dictators like Marcos did not have and perhaps wanted to have. And the reason why Marcos decided to write this kind of project is precisely to take advantage of that kind of power. So that's the another important point that the book likes to highlight. That idea that history is not just knowledge, inert kind of knowledge. It's not just like that. There is something here that is also exerting its own power, influence on us humans. Thereby, that kind of relationship between power and knowledge, you would see them closely interlinked. Next, please. Final major point I'd like to discuss today, whenever we have this idea of official history, and those scholars who join them, we normally take them as exceptions, as aberrations. And these terminologies like intellectual prostitutes, like academic mercenaries, all of these kind of terminologies were labeled, were used in order to expel these scholars from the moral universe of the scholarly community by saying that, oh, they're actually intellectual prostitutes. They're not true scholars. Okay, so this kind of labeling is tantamount to exceptionalizing their case. Okay, but if we're going to take a look at them, this kind of cases is not really exceptional. They may be, what underlies this kind of thing is some kind of a logic that underpins the norm. In day-to-day activities, when everyone, common people, educated, not educated, powerful or not, whenever they use knowledge, they choose the kind of knowledge that they find useful or something that will make them feel good about things. And this kind of logic underpins even the scholarly practice. So this kind of participation in this project, they merely formalized and renders explicit that kind of transactional operation happening on day-to-day basis. The logistics and mechanics of this power relation very differ from one place to another, from whoever is using it, but the underlying logic is similar. Okay? So if you take a look at this kind of logic of power knowledge, that logic operates on all processes of whenever somebody would like to use particular knowledge for a particular purpose. Whether you are a scholar or not, that kind of logic is operative. So in a marketplace of ideas, anyone can use whatever available knowledge, accurate or not, that is favorable for them. And the reason why scholars have the tendency to exceptionalize this kind of projects is precisely because if they don't do that, they endanger the collective interest of the scholarly class. Next, please. So, what are the implications? There are several implications, but I'm just going to discuss now two. For conventional scholarship, by conventional scholarship, those scholarship that do not believe that there is a close relationship between power and knowledge. So this kind of conventional relationship believes in the objectivity. Their idea of knowledge is what is that kind of correspondence to what is real out there. So the implication that I'd like to highlight is for this kind of scholarship, objectivity ought to be taken as not a neutral stance. Okay? It's not a neutral position. The claim to neutrality and rigor is what makes scholarship very useful for unscrupulous political purpose. This kind of position of objectivity or impartiality, that is the wellspring of power of scholarly class. That is what makes scholarly class influential, believable, powerful. And this claim to neutrality, yeah, this is precisely what that kind of unscrupulous use of knowledge. And these people who would like to forbade fake news, for example, and those people who believe in them, they believe in this kind of fake news because they believe that they are true. Okay? So it's so easy for us to dismiss people who believe in Trump, for example, as stupid. But if you take a look at it closely, these people who believe in whatever Trump was saying, they believe that what Trump was saying was true. Okay? And there are reasons why they believe that those things were true. So those idea of objectivity or impartiality of knowledge has long been usurped by the conservatives. And that's what makes it useful for them. And in order for us to address this kind of problem, because what happens in the case of Trump is that the main solution has to do with fact-checking. You keep on fact-checking, say that what Trump was saying was a lie, and that's the main solution that liberal press and liberal scholars have been doing with Trump. But as you can see, apparently this kind of fact-checking is not really working because those people who believe in Trump for some other reasons. And one reason has to do with the fact that they had lost faith in the scholars, what the scholars were saying. And the reasons why they lost faith in what scholars were saying, it goes all the way back to the earlier times when scholars had said something that is not really true, but because they were scholars, they were believed to be true. So those kind of, the loss of faith in this kind of counter-checking, they believe that this kind of fact-checking is yet another political act to destabilize, to negate whatever was Trump was saying. So it's a political act as far as they're concerned. So in my view, what needs to be done is really to pay attention to the very close relationship between power and knowledge. And that's what progressive scholarship has been doing. Progressive scholarship, so many of these critical theories, they start with the idea that knowledge is a function of power. Now, the problem is, if you take a look closely at this kind of theoretical formulation like post-colonial theory, decoloniality, cultural studies, this kind of theories you would see, they are taking power knowledge only to a certain extent. There are things that, as far as they're concerned, does not apply. This kind of power-knowledge relation does not apply. So because of this kind of what I call an analytic constipation, this kind of analysis that is only to a certain degree, only to a certain extent, they're not pushing the logic of power knowledge. This kind of half-hearted power knowledge still makes scholarship, even the critical one, even the progressive scholarship, it can be easily misused by the unscrupulous. And this has been happening, for example, with post-colonial theory, in other critical theory. Their critique of the West, for example, has been utilized by the ultra-nationalists or by the elite in each of these countries in Asia by saying that, see, this kind of an unexpected use of post-colonial critique, it highlights the fact that even that critical scholarship can also be used for very conservative purposes. And the reason, the one thing what we can do in order to address that is to go beyond critique. In my view, one thing that I noted in the book is a critique merely affirms one politics over another. And that is not what presumably most subalterns need in order for them to be empowered. If the idea of critical scholarship is to empower the subalterns, then I think we have to go beyond critique. That's probably not what they need. What they need on the ground is for them, the ability for them to be able to choose among different alternatives, things that can be more beneficial for them. And that's the reason why I suggest a need to do a cartography in accountancy of power knowledge. And in this, by doing this, we render transparent all sources of power that enable knowledge claims. If we are able to map out all these kind of power relations that underpin particular knowledge claim, then we will be in better position to expose to common people, to anyone who care to know why certain knowledge used by certain people, for what purpose, for whom, who gets to be empowered by that, who gets to be disempowered. So in all these kind of questions in the mapping out, when you render all these kind of questions transparent, then people will be in better position to determine, to decide for themselves what they really like to, what will be beneficial for them. And I think that will be a more empowering kind of knowledge rather than a purely kind of critique. On that note, thank you very much.
And Joseph, the time is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kurami, for the presentation. It's a very interesting presentation, and I'm here to make this a discussion for the book and for also the content. But first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Romel and also Atma Jaya Institute of Public Policy for hosting the event here in Atma Jaya campus. This event is also supported by AIFIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies, and CSEASI, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Indonesia. And now I will briefly discuss the issues highlighted in the book. I hope it will not take too much time, since I think it's better for all of us here to take part in the discussion later after this. Dr. Romel's book, aptly titled Power and Knowledge Southeast Asia, States and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines, highlighted two major projects of the making of the official history in Indonesia and the Philippines. In Indonesia, the project is what we know as Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, or SNI, that was commissioned during the new order of Marcos and Suharto, with its principal investigator was the controversial figure of Professor Dr. Nugroho Susanto, which Romel discussed him quite a bit in the book about his background and also his approach. Well, in the Philippines, the Tadhana project, as it was called, was commissioned during the Marcos regimes, and with Dr. Zeus Salazar, among others, as one of the main figures. From these two projects, Dr. Romel wanted to show the complexities of the state and scholar relations within the context of particular national project, i.e. the making of an official history of a country. In his study, he showed not only about the relations between state and scholars, but most importantly, also the relations among the scholars itself. The relations were quite complicated, but at the same time also I found it compelling. A common perspective about the state and scholar relation in this type of grandiose project that were state-sponsored, one would immediately think that there were tight state control and clear directives in the making of the official narrative towards the scholars, especially if the sponsors are the two most notorious dictators in Southeast Asia, which are Marcos and Suharto. On the contrary, Dr. Rommel found it to be the opposite, like what during the presentation he mentioned about it. The scholars in both countries found themselves quite independent in writing, using and arguing their approach in creating this official history, unless when it talks directly about the regime itself, then the regime will interfere. While their sponsor may have some oversights in terms of approving and utilizing their work as part of boosting their legitimacy, but in terms of their working process, the scholars were quite critical among themselves and quite independent. What was also being discussed in the book was how the scholars navigate themselves in making the official history through the scholarly and personal relations among them. Clashes in methodology and also approach between the scholars were in fact at times stronger than any differences that they have with their sponsors. The process of creating the SNI and Tadhana project showed the struggle of the scholars between trying to uphold the professional standard of the profession, but also at the same time pleasing the sponsor, i.e. the regime. To a certain extent, this different interests become manifested into the dynamics of the relation itself. Moreover, changing political context during the beginning, the completion, and also after the fall of both regimes showed how a project that was seen as closely related with the particular regime will also suffer from the fall of the regime itself, regardless how scholarly or objective is the product. The guilty by association perceptions of the scholars with the regime played a significant role in the sustainability of the state-sponsored project. Regardless, the legacy of SNI, that mostly being vilified as the New Order propaganda, and the Tadhana project that were now largely forgotten as it failed to have all its volume published, questions regarding whether the nation need an official history persist. Does a country need to have one official history? What would the goal of having an official history? What is the extent of the role of the state in this type of project? During the dictatorship of Suharto and Marcos, one would argue having an official history was part of cementing a legitimacy of the regime while also serving the need to have a nationalist view of a nation's history, especially in a post-colonial setting. But then, further questions are being asked in how does the nation country accomplish the demand? In reiterating the question that being put by the prominent Southeast Asian historian, the late John Smail, in his famous article on the possibility of an autonomous history of modern Southeast Asia, we can ask similar questions for the possibility of having an autonomous Indonesian, quote-unquote, or Philippine history. Is it possible, and for what purpose? What is the role of the state? Or should we completely ignore state involvement in this kind of project following the liberal spirit of thinking? Or do we actually need it? And with that, I leave these questions for further discussion among us. Thank you.
So thank you, Joseph, for the comment on the book, and I open the floor for questions and answer session. Maybe 2, 3 questions.
But I switch to humanities. Thank you, Pak Rommel. I couldn't agree more with you for so many important points that you pointed out. From the issue of power relations that lingering on Indonesian and the Philippines scholars during the authoritarian regimes period, the issue of the creativity of human subject, like particularly the historians, the issue of attachment and detachment, that is not only happen to historian, but also to sociologists. If we remember the work of Norbert Elias on the process of sociology, he also pointed out things like that. And one of my friends at UE also tried to look at how the production of Indonesian sociology was done in the past. And I myself, as you might be aware, I look at the Indonesian civic education textbook. Textbooks were produced and almost similar points that I concluded in my work. And also at that time, you are right, Pak Romel and Pak Joseph, we in Indonesia, whether you are scholars, you are politicians, or you are students, or orang awam, men in the street, believe that the issue is domination. The issue is the power of the politician, like the President Marcos in the Philippines or Suharto, who would like to preserve status quo, to prolong their power and suppress any diversity and differences. But having said that, I also have questions or related comments. Have you, Pak Romel or Pak Joseph and Pak Yus, ever thought about what I usually call post-colonial context that made this sort of production of historical knowledge possible? That is first, because I suspect from my work with the civic education, there is a sort of interplay of agency, social structure, and culture, particularly in Indonesia at Suharto's times, that made it possible for the regime to produce such knowledge, like PPKN, PKN, PMP, yeah, using Javanese culture, Islamic sort of teachings, and also the condition of post-colonial Indonesia. Then the second thing is that while this is about the production of historical knowledge or knowledge or social knowledge, have you ever, as a media people, have you ever thought about the consumption side, like reading strategy? Who read or who reads? What is the interest of the readers when they are reading it? Whether they find it valuable or not. Because any piece of writing should go to the readers, not to the writers. Yeah, the author is dead. Who goes that? Right? So I found it. This is critical. That is what Romel said. Critical or progressed scholarship rather than conventional wisdoms about the domination, the power above the common people. So this is, and the last thing is, to what extent can we assume that in the democratic climates like this time, particularly like at Jokowi's period, that such production of knowledge influenced by the powerful regime or government happens or is happening? I think that's enough. There are 3 questions with some comments. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Maybe another question from the audience. Mbak Amel.
My name is Amelia from Center for Southeast Asian Studies in IR Department, UPH. I have a lot of questions actually, but I think this is pretty much a struggle of us, a historian and also someone coming from academia. On one hand, if there's a dangerous implication if we always discuss or suspect, put all this suspicion about all this political burden and political nuances behind knowledge production when you speak from academic point of view. On the other hand, it's also common in our time to really think about where's the bias coming from. And I think we pretty much resolve it in academics for the past 2 decades about, acknowledging the bias in any work that we do, acknowledging where the money coming from. So my question is, are you really talking about the manipulation of historical knowledge for political purpose? That's one thing, which is completely manipulation of data, manipulation of interpretation itself with a very strong kind of like political purposes? Or are we talking about a lame historical work? Someone who just like, is not critical, pulling the data and just put it in there. Or are we talking about not simply, but a bias that we cannot avoid today? I mean, everybody, all of us have bias. Even when we choose a certain topic, is our own bias. But we can resolve that. My understanding is we have to keep constructing knowledge and then looking at so many angles and acknowledging those angles and still open up for a discussion. And I think that's pretty much different from the assumption that, this kind of historical project has always political connotation to that. So, I mean, I think we need to differentiate in as many as, possibilities that we can and avoid all this generalization about, power and knowledge and, assuming that it's all about politics. If that's the way we're going to see knowledge construction, and there's no point that we work in academics, or there's no point to have education at all, because bias will be always there. But how we handle bias is something else. But how we handle manipulation of knowledge, it's like completely wrong, right, in academics. So I don't know, I just want to encourage all of us to kind of like think in the critical way these delicate matters. Thank you.
And I think I also have the similar anxiety about this issue, right? So it's not merely about the production of the knowledge itself, but the dissemination of the knowledge, whether or not we are equipped with tools or to interrogate the sources, to acknowledge our bias. And I don't know, for one, I never read SNI, but I read things that the teachers gave me in the school. Like me in the past, always thought that history is all about hafalan or memorizing the year, memorizing the things. But it's also a part of dissemination of the knowledge that has been produced by those scholars. So I think we have the same anxiety here, and maybe you have comments on that. Thanks.
Any more? Okay, that very I'm very glad with the questions. These are really questions that goes into the heart of this book. This is really what this book is about. That kind of anxiety, yeah, as Amelia very well put it, that kind of anxiety of the danger of generalizing this kind of, that knowledge production is political. Because that leads us to this kind of infinite regress, okay? That will deprive us a standpoint to really build what is really that kind of knowledge that will be true, that will be accurate, that will be beneficial. That's precisely the main thing. The main thing, that kind of anxiety that also drove me to undertake this book. Perhaps I can answer that question by providing you with some background on how did I come up with this kind of analysis. When the first time that I encountered post-colonial theory, and in post-colonial theory, power knowledge is one of the key pillars of this kind of analysis. I was struck by how, in my view, correct this kind of power-knowledge relation is. And before my exposure to post-colonial theory, I have some understanding of Buddhist, Taoist philosophies. And one thing that struck me in Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist kind of philosophies is what may be regarded as anti-rational, anti-intellectual kind of things. So when you say, for example, that the world is an illusion, for the Buddhists, one of the key pillars in the belief in the Buddhism, the world is an illusion, it's a maya. It seems to be a stupid kind of statement. But if you take a look at it, you'd realize that there's some truth in it. What we see is just what we see based on our human perception. The reality might be something more in depth, but we mistake what we see as the truth. Okay? So if, for example, we see from the outside a lot of trees with green leaves, so it's objective. Say, oh, it's an objective truth that the trees are green. But let's just suppose that we are able to ask the tree, are your leaves green? Will the tree answer? Probably the trees will answer, what leaves are you talking about? What green are you talking about? So we are the one who imposed the idea of greenness into the tree or into the leaves. And we regard that as truth, as objective truth. Okay? So this kind of exposure to Asian philosophies, it made me say, oh, post-colonial theory makes a lot of sense. That kind of power-knowledge relation, it makes a lot of sense. But one thing that struck me in post-colonial theory is that kind of ambivalence. Ambivalence. It is very radical, but only to a certain degree. When, for example, Spivak was talking, he was very critical of essentialism. But at the end of the day, he came up with the idea of strategic essentialism. So what is this kind of anxiety that won't allow them to push the logic to its conclusion? So that's my thing. And then I got exposed to cases when post-colonial theory was being misused for purposes that was not expected. It was very critical, and at the same time, at the end of the day, it supports a very ultranationalist project in Malaysia, in India, for example. So here is this kind of situation that critical theory is there, and yet it's being used by the already powerful to further empower themselves. So what I had in mind is, if critical theory can be used by the already powerful to further empower themselves, what hope is there left to the marginalized? What hope is there really help for the marginalized? Because these critical theorists, these scholars, these are the well-meaning scholars who devote their life because they believe that what they're doing really will be put into a good use. And at the end of the day, the problem is knowledge, once it circulates in the social space, it assumes life of its own. So as mentioned by Freddie earlier, how about the idea of consumption? Okay? How about those from the standpoint of the readers? In reality, all knowledge production is consumption at the same time. Okay? Those who produce knowledge are also consuming knowledge because it cannot be otherwise. We can only build from what is already there. Okay? We cannot build from nowhere. So what scholars are doing are not really producing in that sense of but consuming in a particular way. Okay? So the problem with scholars is that they privilege their position. Okay? They privilege their position. And by privileging their position, they regard themselves as the gatekeepers of knowledge. Because and by doing that, by standing on the position of the intellectualist bias, they regard their position as the privileged position that it should not be questioned. So when they actually consume knowledge, they regard it as production. But if we take a look at it closely, it's actually all this kind of knowledge is a consumption kind of thing. And one reason, in my view, why scholars have the tendency to de-emphasize consumption and focus on knowledge production has to do with this that idea of it's part of the source of the wellspring of power of scholars lies on the fundamental assumption that reality can be known. Reality can be known. And through scholarship, rigorous scholarship, that can be done. So that is the wellspring of the power of the scholarly class. And when we do that, they are, in the scheme of things, they are empowered in this kind of scheme. And that kind of assumption puts the scholarly community at the center of things. That fundamental assumption that knowledge, that reality can be known, stands as the most clear, as the clearest manifestation of that is the scholarly community that we can easily see through the university. And in this kind of manifestation, okay, that kind of physical manifestation of that assumption that reality can be known, and this is commonly applied when we talk about objectivity, this is precisely as well what is needed by the politically powerful. That is precisely what is needed by the politically powerful in order to make their political stands possible. So their misuse of knowledge that I saw when I observed how post-colonial theory was being misused emanated from the idea that knowledge, that reality can be known. Okay? That kind of objectivity and impartiality. So, the postmodernism is often blamed for this kind of multiple stance. They say that because of postmodernism, we no longer have a solid platform to build our knowledge. If we take a look closely at how postmodernism developed, and power knowledge is one of the main driving force there, what we are going to realize is it is precisely what they wish everyone, what the postmodern scholars wish everyone to understand, that all knowledge, regardless of whether it is true or not, is power-driven. And by realizing that it's power-driven, the fundamental question that will be asked is responsibility. If you are exercising power, then you have to be accountable. Okay? That sense of accountability that needs to be asked. Now, the presence of scholarly community and the idea that reality can be known erases the question of responsibility. Everyone naturalizes their own claim as supposedly natural, as supposed to be real. So we easily forget that any knowledge is human-made. It cannot be otherwise. And because it is human-made, then we have to take responsibility for the way how we create and how we consume. By capitalizing on the idea of objectivity and impartiality, which the scholarly community in the university represent, those questions are elided. Take a look at how famous, very bad, very evil people, for example, Hitler. Hitler wouldn't, he would claim that what he did was right. Okay? He would claim Pol Pot. When Pol Pot was, for example, was interviewed towards the end of his life, he felt he didn't have any responsibility because the idea, it was the truth, it was the reality that needed to be pursued. So, all this kind of claim, okay, a lot of politically motivated heinous crimes or all these kind of politically motivated actions, they were built on the idea that it is true, it is real. Okay? And what enabled them to do that is precisely what the scholars were claiming to be objective and impartial. So, if we're going to offer a solution, the solution is to acknowledge that all knowledge is really power-driven. And from that point on, the more fundamental question is not whether knowledge is true or false or accurate or not. But the more fundamental question is whose power is driving this particular kind of knowledge, who will benefit from it, okay, who will be disadvantaged. Okay, because the position of scholarship, position of scholar in the community has to deal with determining what is true and what is false. In the process, they are the ones really benefited from this. So, the well-intentions of scholars, that is precisely what is being misused by the unscrupulous. And that is precisely what this book is trying to address, to offer an alternative way how to handle this kind of situation. And because of that, perhaps we can do this kind of cartography. Rather than saying true or false, more important for people on the ground. What is important for more people on the ground is not whether knowledge is true or false. If we take a look at it closely, what is important on the people on the ground is which knowledge would be more useful for them or not. Which will make them better person or not. Yes? There cannot be indeterminism. Okay? That will happen only if power will perfectly be equal. But power, the distribution of power in society will forever be unequal. So, there will always be some claim that will appear to be more true than others. So that idea of nihilism, indeterminism, these are boogeymans. Okay? It makes us afraid to push the logic of power knowledge. In reality, there's not going to be any nihilism. Precisely because on the ground, power is unequally distributed. It cannot be otherwise. Okay? So there will always be knowledge that will appear more true than others. probably people on the ground really don't matter that, they don't really mind that much kind of question. Perhaps for people on the ground, this kind of question probably will be asked more by people who are like you and me. Okay? But people on the ground will be, it's likely that they have other concerns. Okay? But because we are, part of our intellectualist bias is to regard our position, regard intellectual, that kind of privilege in solving problems. Okay? When we, wait. Okay. I got this idea from Bourdieu, and he said with that kind of scholastic fallacy. So Bourdieu made it clear that intellectuals have their way of thinking, way of doing things, which may be different from ordinary common people. And this kind of scholastic fallacy is very much expressed, very much evident in what scholars do. They privilege intellectual position as the dominant standpoint. So we're thinking that people on the ground, if they, like for example in the case of populism, so we say, these people are so populist, they're so ignorant, they easily obey this this kind of ideologue. But for once, we think that our sense of intellectual superiority, perhaps they have a different kind of mindset that is driven by their own life, okay? And we cannot assume that simply because our rational mind, because we have studied so long, then we understood really what they like, okay? What they like. And what's believed for them? We have a tendency to believe that we know what is the solution to their problem, but perhaps not. Okay? Perhaps not. We may have this kind of possibility. We have to be open to that kind of possibility. And that becomes clear once you push the logic of power and knowledge. Okay? So our sense of superiority of the intellectual standpoint will be explained by our assumption that our position is the more powerful position.
Curious and just to not to friendly warn you that many people, yeah, Pak Joseph and Pak Yus, tend to criticize postmodernists and post-structuralists, that they rarely devise sort of knowledge like that. But I agree with you on the point that you mentioned. That is, you mentioned about ambivalent, about how we know knowledge, and there is kind of. But I would really again remind you about. I find it out that when you mention about authors, historians, and the leaders, we actually come to what Richard Rorty's book, title of the book, exactly prescribe what you just mentioned. That is irony. Irony, contingency, and solidarity. And this irony exactly prescribe what you just mentioned about we really don't know how to describe power, etc. Whether we know that we really know. That is what Rorty said. That when he mentioned, but this book is green, I cannot claim this is true unless you agree, Pak Yos or Pak Joseph. Until the consumer say that, yes, it is true, it is green. That's Rorty gave the example. That is. So, thanks very much. But it's a good exercise to talk about. Right.
What if we change the true or false into something like valid or invalid? Will it change the implications of how we consume knowledge, how we produce knowledge? Because true or false, as you say, it's driven, knowledge as true or false is power driven, and different people may have different position, or they may not really think about which one is the truth for them. What if we introduce or we change it to valid or invalid? Will it change the whole discussion about knowledge production and consumption?
Thank you very much. Very good question. The validity or invalidity will also have to be determined. There must be as an authority who will determine what is valid or invalid, right? So at the end of the day, traditionally scholars have that kind of authority. But you see, what happened in the post-Trump period is that, this kind of anti-intellectualism has been ongoing for long, even before. But when Trump became president, it came out in the open, right? So this traditional authority of the scholars has been downplayed or questioned, and there are emerging alternative who will do that. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the of power relation is changing, but the fundamental logic that still power, whoever that power is or whatever that power is deciding what will be the basis for being valid. The logic is maintained. It's just a question of who. Okay, yes, Amelia.
To those who really like into all this post-colonial, post-positivist worldview, if I can say, we really avoid binary opposition. That's what we want to attack. You know, it's not fair to just judge things based on A or B, X or Y. It's also anti-putting things into boxes. But as we observe, up to the point, like exactly what you mentioned, Donald Trump, and it's been very offensive, like really manipulate this very perspective of this, post-positivist ideas into this power relation by establishing this alternative fact, you know. I think either you are like positivist, post-positivist, standpoint or perspective that you have, we cannot avoid, and there will be always there, possibilities for power destructive. Either you do believe, you can like perceive, you can understand, universe is waiting out there for us to decipher, to understand, or you come from completely opposite point of view. Oh, everything is like the human that actually construct the reality. Regardless what position you are, we are always prone for this power interruption. And I do agree when you said that that's one of the post-colonial agenda, to make us realize that knowledge, regardless what standpoint, worldview you're coming from, is always prone to this power interruption. But it leads us to the next question. So do we need to give up knowledge construction? Because no matter what, I think Joseph mentioned about this, about 65 event in one of his writings, that there's no way for us to to continue struggle but keep producing knowledge. That's the only way to provide resistance to this power play. There's no other way. I mean, once we stop producing knowledge, it means we just give up to whatever power interest that, like to take over this space. But from a little bit optimistic side, I think 20 years ago, in the social sciences, people try to kind of like resolve all this anxiety by by looking at the knowledge construction as a space for social transformation. So include different agency into knowledge construction. So instead of putting like scholar as the only, Mahaguru, the only person who provide truth, you include your friends. We used to call them informants, now they are friends. Include them to this, now I feel guilty. Yeah, colleague, friends on the field, include your friends into this knowledge construction, and in the same way, we establish a kind of dialogic relationship. So knowledge construction then, from the point of view, is seen as a kind of a dialogue processes in which both scholars and ordinary or non-scholars, communities can learn from each other and eventually transform together to make whatever truth or maybe possible truths with plural, and eventually we have to evolve that way. Otherwise, power will be always there. There will be some powerful people with money, with status, that will always try to hijack knowledge. It's happened over time.
Yeah, that's really one of the points that I highlighted, that at the end of the day, we really cannot avoid power relations. The solution, in my view, is just accept it, and that makes it a starting point. Okay, and it's good that you mentioned about this effort to be more participatory in the approach and method. It's no longer scholars who had the sole authority, and that's really a way forward to this kind of thing. One thing I noticed, and for example, if we take a look at you see this New Zealand scholar, very famous about the critical methodology, pushing for indigenous, what's the name, something Smith, okay? And so this approach is really more participatory, involving community, and you really have to secure, for example, you have to be very sensitive to the community interests in order for you to do this kind of approach. But at the end of the day, as you said, the power again will be hijacked by somebody more powerful in that community, in the indigenous community in New Zealand, for example. So you replicate that kind of logic of hierarchy. And the knowledge that was supposed to be for the good of the community, it turns out to be more useful for a certain group and not beneficial for another. Okay? So that's the reason why in my view, what needs to be looked at is how actually knowledge is being used on the ground. Because our tendency, by determining what is true and false and valid or invalid, we focus on the production. Okay? But what really matters on the life of common people is how knowledge affects them. So it's more consumption, how it is being used by whom, and how it affects this group of people. So my idea of cartography is focused on the actual knowledge use, okay? And how this knowledge is actually being used, and who benefits and who is disadvantaged by it. And then so people on the ground will know, so this kind of knowledge is something like this and like that. It's up to them at the end of the day. If the idea of critical scholarship is to empower the common people, the marginalized, we have to start from how they use, how they understand, how they are affected by knowledge, rather than from our side
that we analyze, we employ techniques, this kind of concepts, theories. That serves our interest as scholars. And even if we employ this kind of dialogic approach, is still the imprimatur of the scholarly class that gets to be, that goes along when things are published. So it's still the authority underlying with a PhD and with somebody who participated. Is still that it. And in the way how it's going to be used, that's effectively the one that will determine whether it was useful for the marginalized or not. So that's the reason why I focus more on how things are actually being used on the ground, affecting them. And I think that's the way how critical scholarship should go. Rather than, by the way, last July, I attended critical theory workshop in Paris, the heartland of critical theory, for 3 weeks. And I was struck by all this kind of, well, I expected somewhat I expected it because critical theory is like that. But I was still struck by when you see things happening that they keep on hair-splitting concepts and approach and all this kind of thing. And I raised some question to the idea that perhaps those people, the marginalized, perhaps they are not thinking like that. Perhaps that's not what they really needed. And of course, they didn't like that kind of question. So because I was raising that kind of possibility that all this kind of hair-splitting debates about methods, concepts happening within critical community scholars, at the end of the day, will not really empower the people they are supposed to empower. It will only empower those scholars who are doing critical scholarship by publishing and all. So the question that I raised was something that they didn't like to hear. But that's the idea. If we really wish to be critical in our scholarly approach, we have to look into how people actually affected and how they're consuming knowledge. Because that's the way how we may be able to empower them. So, yeah, that kind of bias, we really cannot avoid that. And despite our tendency to, we have this kind of tendency to be self-reflexive, came from this background, all of this kind of thing will be intermediate. The effect of this will only be intermediate. At the end of the day, what we will decide the material impact on the people on the ground is how actual knowledge will be used. And that's the idea of cartography that I was talking about.
Okay, our discussion this afternoon has turned into very philosophical one and very deep. Oh my God. Yeah. Wow, I didn't expect this when I accept the Arif's proposal to moderate this discussion. But anyway, Kuraming and Dr. Jakababa for today's event. Thank you.